Psychiatrists predicted that most participants would quit at 150 volts when the victim first asks to be freed. They also predicted that only about 4% of the participants would continue to shock the victim after he refused to respond, and that less than 1% would administer the highest shock on the generator. How do people respond when they are actually in the situation? Milgram found, in the typical study described above, that the great majority of participants, some 67%, continued to administer shocks to the very maximum level of shock. Although some of them required a considerable degree of prodding from the experimenter, the obedient individuals did not continue administering shocks because they were particularly sadistic or cruel people. Indeed, when Milgram and Alan Elms compared participants' scores on a series of standardized personality tests, they discovered no differences between conformity 43 individuals who were fully obedient and those who successfully resisted the pressure to obey. 39 Nor were obedient people insensitive to the apparent plight of the learner. Some protested, many sweated, trembled, stuttered, and showed other signs of tension. Some burst out in fits of nervous laughter. But they continued to obey to the very end. This behavior is not limited to American men living in Connecticut. Wherever the Milgram procedure has been tried, it has produced a significant degree of obedience. For example, several replications of the experiment 40 have demonstrated that people in Australia, Jordan, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands react in much the same way as the people in Milgram's original experiment. Similarly, women are just as obedient as men. 41 And a replication of the basic Milgram procedure conducted in 2007 by Jerry Berger proves that high levels of obedience in the Milgram experiment are not artifacts of a bygone era. Today's modern American is every bit as susceptible to being led to shock an innocent victim as his or her counterparts in the 1950s. 42. Implications: An astonishingly large proportion of people will cause pain to other people in obedience to authority. The research may have important counterparts in the world outside of the experimental laboratory. For example, it is difficult to read about these studies without noticing some similarity between the behavior of the teachers in Milgram's experiment and the blind obedience expressed by Adolf Eichmann, who attributed his responsibility for the murder of millions of innocent civilians to the fact that he was a good bureaucrat merely obeying orders issued by his superiors in the Nazi regime. During the war in Vietnam, Lieutenant William Calley, who was convicted of the deliberate and unprovoked murder of Vietnamese women and children at My Lai, freely admitted to these acts but said he felt this was justifiable obedience to the authority of his superior officers. More recently, it has become clear that the torture and humiliation administered to Iraqi prisoners of war in Abu Ghraib prison was not an isolated incident. 43 Although military leaders were quick to blame this behavior on a few bad apples, and court-martialed them, the facts in the case suggest that Abu Ghraib was indeed another instance of obedience to authority. In each of these cases, the individuals who perpetrated the mistreatment of others claimed that 44 the social animal, they were simply following orders. Interestingly, one of Milgram's obedient participants, when questioned after the session, replied, "I stopped, but he kept going." As provocative as these comparisons are, we should be cautious lest we overinterpret Milgram's results, given that 67% of the participants in Milgram's experiment complied with the experimenter's command. Some commentators have been tempted to suggest that perhaps most people would have behaved as Adolf Eichmann did if they found themselves in a similar situation. This may be true, but it should be emphasized that there are, in fact, some important factors in the situation encountered by each man in Milgram's study that tend to maximize obedience. Because he freely consented to participate, he had every reason to assume that the learner had also volunteered. Accordingly, it is likely that he felt that they were both obligated to avoid disrupting the experiment. Moreover, he faced the demands of the experimenter alone. A variation of the study demonstrated that the proportion of fully obedient people dropped to just 10% when they were joined by two fellow teachers who defied the experimenter. 44 Also, in most of Milgram's studies, The authority figure issuing the orders was a scientist in a prestigious laboratory at Yale University, and his cover story credits the experiment as being an investigation of an important scientific question. In our society, we have been conditioned to believe that scientists tend to be responsible, benevolent people of high integrity. This is especially true if the scientist is affiliated with a well-known and highly respected institution like Yale. The participants might reasonably assume, then, that no scientist would issue orders that would result in the death or injury of a human as a part of his experiment. This was clearly not true in Nazi Germany, My Lai, or Abu Ghraib. Some evidence in support of this conjecture comes from further research by Milgram. He conducted a separate study 45 comparing the obedience of people to the commands of a scientist at Yale University with the obedience of people to the commands of a scientist working in a suite of offices in a rather run-down commercial building in the downtown shopping area of the industrial city of Bridgeport, Connecticut. In this study, the Yale scientist achieved an obedience rate of 65% compared with only 48% in Bridgeport. Thus, removing the prestige of Yale University did seem to reduce the degree of obedience somewhat. Conformity 45. Of course, 48% is still a high figure. Would even fewer people have obeyed if the person conducting the experiment were not a scientist or another legitimate authority figure? Milgram addressed this question in another version of the study, in which the scientist experimenter was replaced at the last minute by a non-authoritative substitute. Here's how it worked. After making the usual preparations for the learning task, but without designating what shock levels were to be used, the experimenter was called away from the laboratory by a prearranged telephone call. Another participant assumed the experimenter's role. The substitute pretended to hit upon the idea of having the teacher raise the shock level every time the learner made a mistake. He also prodded the teacher to proceed with the shocks, just as the scientist experimenter had done in previous versions of the experiments. Under these conditions, the proportion of fully obedient participants plummeted to 20%, demonstrating that, for most people, only legitimate authority can command high obedience, not just any person assuming the role of authority. Another factor that reduces the extent of obedience is the physical absence of the authority figure. Milgram found that, when the experimenter was out of the room and issued his orders by telephone, the number of fully obedient participants dropped to below 25%. Moreover, several of the people who continued with the experiment cheated. Specifically, they administered shocks of lower intensity than they were supposed to, and never bothered to tell the experimenter that they deviated from the proper procedure. This last datum, I feel, represents a touching attempt by some individuals to respond to the demands of legitimate authority while at the same time minimizing the pain they inflict on others. It is reminiscent of the behavior of Dunbar, a character in Joseph Heller's classic war novel Catch-22. During World War II, Dunbar is ordered to bomb some villages in Italy. Unwilling either to rebel openly or to harm innocent civilians, he drops his bombs over empty fields close to the Italian villages designated as his targets. Dunbar's sensitivity to the potential victims of his bombs is especially poignant, given the distance and anonymity afforded by his position high in the sky above the villagers. Indeed, Milgram found in subsequent studies that the farther teachers were from the learner, the more willing they were to obey the commands of authority. 46. The social animal. When teachers actually saw the learner, only 40% continued to deliver painful shocks compared with 67% who merely heard the learner's cries of agony. Similarly, when teachers were instructed to physically force the learner's arm down on the shock plate, instead of using the more remote shock generator to deliver shocks, the rate of obedience dropped to 30%. Thus, vividly witnessing the suffering of others makes it more difficult to continue inflicting pain upon them. Conversely, the weapons used in modern warfare preclude such close proximity to potential victims, making it easier for those who wield the instruments of death to be indifferent to the plight of innocent targets. In a set of experiments conducted in the Netherlands, Wim and Quinten Rijmakers 46 explored the issue of obedience and distance in a slightly different manner. In addition to successfully replicating the original Milgram procedure, they tried it a different way. In the new procedure, the experimenter asked people to obey them by making a series of increasingly negative remarks about an applicant's performance on a test that would determine whether he or she would be hired for a job. Thus, the participants were convinced that they were harming the person, but the harm was such that it would not be manifested until some future time, when the participants would not be present to witness the consequences of their obedience. As one might expect, obedience in these situations was much higher than in their direct replication of the Milgram experiment. In this version, more than 90% of the participants continued to obey to the very end of the series. Disobedience in the Milgram experiments. As you know, several people in the Milgram experiments chose to defy the experimenter and refused to continue with the experiment, in spite of the prodding of the experimenter. Human history, likewise, contains many inspiring examples of such courage. For example, there are freedom museums in Norway, Denmark, and other European countries that celebrate the efforts of a heroic few to resist the occupation of the Nazis or to attempt to help Jews escape the ravages of the Holocaust. But these acts of humanity and bravery, however encouraging, should not blind us to the pervasiveness of our tendency to obey authority. Many of us tour such museums and admire the displays, certain that we, too, would exhibit such courage. We harbor, conformity 47, a myth of our personal invulnerability to obedience pressures. When participants were asked to predict their own performance in the Milgram study, their values and self-conceptions caused 100% of them to predict that they would discontinue the shocks at or below the moderate level. 47 But we have seen how the forces of the actual situation can override those values and self-conceptions. One year, when, as usual, I asked my social psychology students whether any believed that they might continue to deliver shocks until the end of the scale, only one hand slowly rose. Everyone else in the class was confident that he or she would defy the experimenter's instructions. But the student who raised his hand was a Vietnam veteran who was in a position to know. He had experienced the impact of similar pressures, and he painfully and tragically came to recognize his own vulnerability in certain situations. Indeed, not only do we find it difficult to resist pressures to hurt people, we often avoid taking action when presented with opportunities to help others. The uninvolved bystander as conformist. In 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death in New York City. This was a tragic event but not, in itself, a particularly novel occurrence. After all, in a major population center, brutal murders are not uncommon. What is interesting about this event was that, according to news reports, 38 of her neighbors came to their windows at 3 a.m. in response to her screams of terror, and remained at their windows watching in fascination for the 30 minutes it took her assailant to complete his grisly deed. During that time, he returned for 3 separate attacks. The New York Times claimed that no one came to her assistance, no one so much as lifted the phone to call the police until it was too late. 48 The story produced a rash of speculations and hand-wringing about the apathy of people who live in cities. Why would people not help a neighbor in distress? Well, perhaps the onlookers were sleepy or dazed. After all, people are hardly in full control of their mental faculties at 3 o'clock in the morning. Perhaps. But it was in broad daylight that Eleanor Bradley, while shopping on Fifth Avenue in New York City, tripped, fell, and broke her leg. She lay there for 40 minutes in a state of shock. 48 The social animal, while literally hundreds of passers-by paused momentarily to gawk at her and then kept on walking. Why did these bystanders fail to help? Are people impervious to the distress of others? Have they become so accustomed to disaster that they can be nonchalant in the face of pain and violence? Were the bystanders in these situations different from you and me in some way? The answer to all of these questions appears to be no. Interviews conducted with the bystanders in the Genovese murder revealed that they were anything but nonchalant. They were horrified. Why, then, Didn't they intervene? This is a difficult question to answer. One possible explanation concerns the existence of different norms for helping in large cities as opposed to smaller towns. Several experiments 49 have found that the likelihood of receiving help is greater in non-urban than in urban locales. However, these studies examine small requests for help, change for a quarter, the correct time, and so forth. Whether these rural-urban differences occur in serious emergency situations, like those faced by Kitty Genovese and Eleanor Bradley, is unclear. More convincing explanations have been suggested by a series of ingenious experiments conducted by John Darley, Biblatine, and their colleagues. 50 These investigators hypothesize that the large number of people witnessing the tragedies militated against anyone's helping, that is, a victim is less likely to get help if a large number of people are watching his or her distress. Thus, non-intervention can be viewed as an act of conformity. In this case it appears that, for each individual, the other people were defining the reasonableness and appropriateness of helping or not helping. As we have seen, it is often reasonable to take one's cue from others. Occasionally, however, it can be misleading, and it tends to be particularly misleading in critical situations. In our society, it is considered uncool to reveal strong emotions in public. When we are with others, most of us try to appear less fearful, less worried, less anxious, or less sexually aroused than we really are. For example, from the blasé looks on the faces of the patrons of topless nightclubs, one would never guess that they were turned on or even interested. Similarly, the proverbial visitor from Mars would never suspect the anxiety of the patients in a dentist's waiting room by observing the impassive looks on their faces. With these things in mind, let us consider the case of the woman who fell and broke her leg on Fifth Avenue. Suppose you arrived at Conformity 49, the scene 10 minutes after she fell. You see a woman lying on the ground in apparent discomfort. What else do you see? You see scores of people walking past the woman, glancing at her, and continuing on their way. How will you define the situation? You may conclude that it's inappropriate for you to intervene. Perhaps it's not serious, perhaps she's intoxicated, perhaps she is play-acting, perhaps the whole thing is staged for candid camera, and you will make a fool of yourself on national television if you intervene. After all, you ask yourself, if it's so damned important, why are none of these other people doing anything about it? Thus, the fact that there are a lot of other people around, rather than increasing the likelihood that someone will help, actually decreases the likelihood that any one of them will help. 51 This is an interesting conjecture, but is it true? To find out, Biblatine and Judith Rodin 52 conducted an experiment constructed around a lady in distress. In this experiment, a female experimenter asked 120 male Columbia University students to fill out a questionnaire. The experimenter then retired to the next room through an unlocked collapsible curtain, saying she would return when the students finished the questionnaire. A few minutes later, she staged an accident. What the students actually heard was the sound of the young woman climbing a chair, followed by a loud scream and a crash, as if the chair had collapsed and she had fallen to the floor. They then heard moaning and crying and the anguished statement, "Oh, my God, my foot, I can't move it. Oh, my ankle, I can't get this thing off me." The cries continued for about a minute and gradually subsided. The experimenters were interested in determining whether the participants would come to the young woman's aid. The important variable in the experiment was whether the people were alone in the room. Of those who were alone, 70% offered to help the young woman. Of those who were participating in pairs with strangers, only 20% offered help. Thus, it is clear that the presence of another bystander tends to inhibit action. This phenomenon has been dubbed the bystander effect. When interviewed subsequently, the unhelpful participants who had been in the room with another person said they had concluded that the accident probably wasn't serious, at least in part because of the inactivity of their partner. In the Genovese murder, there was probably an additional reason the bystanders did not help. In such a situation it may be that, if P.O. 50 the social animal, People are aware that an event is being witnessed by others. The responsibility felt by any individual is diffused. Each witness to the Genovese slaying who noticed lights flick on and faces watching in several other windows might have felt no personal responsibility to act, since others were watching. Each bystander could have concluded that someone else was calling the police or that it was someone else's duty to do so. To test this idea, Darley and Latine 53 arranged an experimental situation in which people were placed in separate rooms but were able to communicate with one another by microphones and earphones. Thus, the participants could hear one another but couldn't see one another. The investigators then staged a simulated epileptic attack. They played a tape recording of a supposed epileptic seizure on the part of one of the participants. In one experimental condition, each person was led to believe that he or she was the only one whose intercom was tuned in during the seizure. In other conditions, each person was led to believe that one or more people were also tuned in. Those who thought they were the only listener were far more likely to leave their room and try to help than were those who thought others were listening, too. As the number of people listening increased, the likelihood of offering assistance decreased. The behavior of the onlookers in the Genovese murder case and the participants in the Darley-Latine experiments projects a rather grim picture of the human condition. Is it true that people avoid helping each other if at all possible, that is, if someone provides a bad example by not intervening or if the responsibility for action seems the least bit diffuse? Perhaps not. Perhaps there are situations in which people are inspired to come to the aid of their fellows. An incident in my own experience may shed some light on this issue. I was backpacking in Yosemite National Park several years ago. It was late at night, and I was just dropping off to sleep when I heard a man's voice cry out. I couldn't be certain whether it was a cry of pain, surprise, or joy. I had no idea whether some people were just horsing around or whether one of my fellow campers was being attacked by a bear. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and looked around, trying to shake the cobwebs out of my head and trying to ascertain the place from which the scream had come, when I noticed a strange phenomenon. From all over the area, myriad flickering lights were converging on a single point. These were lanterns and flashlights being carried by dozens of campers running to the aid of the individual who had, Conformity 51, screamed. It turned out that his scream had been one of surprise caused by a relatively harmless flare-up in his gasoline stove. The other campers seemed almost disappointed when they learned that no help was needed. They trudged back to their tents and, I assume, dropped off to sleep immediately. Not so with me, however. I tossed and turned, unable to get back to sleep. As a social psychologist with a great deal of faith in scientific data, I spent the night puzzling over the fact that my fellow campers had behaved in a totally different manner from the participants in the Darley-Latine experiments. Why had those campers behaved so differently? In what way were the situations different? There were at least two factors operating in the campground that were either not present or present only to a very small degree in the situations previously discussed. One of these factors is reflected in my use, in the preceding paragraph, of the term my fellow campers. Specifically, a feeling of common fate or mutuality may be engendered among people sharing the same interests, pleasures, hardships, and environmental conditions of a closed environment like a campground. A stronger feeling of mutuality than there is among people who are merely residents of the same country, county, or city. A second, somewhat related factor is that there was no escape from the face-to-face aspect of the situation. The onlookers in the Genovese case could walk away from their windows into the relative protection and isolation of their own homes. The people on Fifth Avenue could walk past the woman lying on the sidewalk and keep on going, right out of her environment. The participants in the Darley-Latine experiments were not in a face-to-face relationship with the victim. And they knew they could escape from the environment in a very short time. In the campground, the events were occurring in a relatively restricted environment. The campers were going to have to face squarely the next morning whatever they allowed to happen that night. It seems that, under these circumstances, individuals are more willing to take responsibility for one another. Of course, this is mere speculation. The behavior of the campers at Yosemite, while provocative, is not conclusive because it was not part of a controlled experiment. One of the major problems with observational data like these is that the observer has no control over who the people in the situation are. Thus, differences between people always loom as a possible explanation for the differences in their behavior. For example, one might argue that individuals who go camping, 52 the social animal, are, by nature or experience, kinder, gentler, more thoughtful, and more humane than New Yorkers. Perhaps they were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts as children, hence their interest in camping, and, in scouting, they were taught to be helpful to other people. One of the reasons for doing experiments is to control this kind of uncertainty. Indeed, a subsequent experiment lends support to my speculation about my campground experience. This was an experiment performed by Irving Pilyavin and his associates 54 in one of the cars of a train in the New York City subway system. In this experiment, an accomplice of the experimenters staggered and collapsed in the presence of several individuals riding the subway. The victim remained stretched out on the floor of the train, staring at the ceiling. This scene was repeated 103 times under a variety of conditions. The most striking result was that, a large part of the time, people spontaneously rushed to the aid of the stricken individual. This was especially true when the victim was made to seem obviously ill. In more than 95% of the trials, someone offered help immediately, even when the victim had been given a liquor bottle to carry and was made to reek of alcohol. He received immediate help from someone on 50% of the trials. Unlike the behavior of the participants that Darley and Latane dealt with, the helping behavior of the people on the subway train was not affected by the number of bystanders. People helped just as often and just as speedily on crowded trains as they did on virtually empty trains. Although the people doing the helping were New Yorkers, they were also in an environment that, although very much unlike Yosemite National Park, did have two things in common with the campground. People riding on the same subway car do have the feeling of sharing a common fate, and they were in a face-to-face situation with the victim from which there was no immediate escape. How can the tendency to help be increased? Consider the questions that would run through your mind should you confront a possible emergency. Is the situation really serious? Does it require my personal intervention? Will helping be difficult or costly for me? Will my help benefit the victim? Can I easily leave? Your response to the situation will depend on your answers to each of these questions. The first prerequisite for helping is to define the situation as an emergency. We have seen that the clues provided by the presence of conformity 53, unresponsive bystanders can discourage other onlookers from concluding that an emergency exists. But the interpretations of bystanders can also influence perceptions in the opposite direction. In an experiment conducted by Leonard Bickman, 55 female students sitting in cubicles and listening over intercoms heard a crash and a victim's scream, followed by the reaction of a witness to the apparent accident. When the participants heard the witness interpret the event as a certain emergency, they helped more frequently and more quickly than when the interpretation was uncertain or when the event was labeled a non-emergency. The less ambiguous the emergency, the greater the likelihood of helping. Defining the situation as an emergency is the first step, assuming personal responsibility for intervening is the next. Onlookers are more likely to help when they cannot reduce their sense of responsibility by assuming others will act. I have described an experiment by Darley and Latane demonstrating that people help more when they think they are the only ones aware of an emergency. In Bickman's experiments, although the participants thought others were aware of the situation, some were led to believe that the other participants were unable to respond. Specifically, some of the female students were informed that the other participants they would hear over the intercom were located in nearby cubicles, while others were told that one voice was originating from a nearby cubicle but that the other participant was speaking from a different building. People responded significantly more speedily to the emergency in the latter condition when they perceived that the other bystander was unable to help. In fact, the people who could not diffuse their responsibility intervened as quickly as those who thought nobody else heard the accident. Although an event might be a clear emergency that demands their aid, People help less when the costs of their assistance are high. In a variation of the Billy Evans's subway experiments, 56, the victim sometimes bit a capsule of red dye as he collapsed, so that he appeared to be bleeding from the mouth. Though the fake blood made the emergency appear more serious, the bleeding victims were helped less frequently than those who collapsed without bleeding. Apparently, potential helpers were scared or repulsed by the blood, reducing their inclination to help. Other kinds of costs also can enter the calculation, including seemingly trivial ones, as John Darley and 54 the social animal, Daniel Batson 57 cleverly illustrated. They enlisted divinity students at Princeton Theological Seminary, ostensibly for the purpose of recording a speech. Each student practiced his talk in one room, then he was instructed to walk to another building, where his presentation would be taped. At this point, some of the students were told they were late for their appointment and were hurried out, others were told they were on time, and the rest that they had time to spare. On their way to the recording session in the other building, the students encountered an apparent victim slumped in a doorway, with head down and eyes closed, coughing pathetically. More than half of these future ministers who were early or on time stopped to assist the victim, but only 10% of those who thought they were late for their appointment offered help, even when the speech they were to deliver involved the parable of the Good Samaritan. In addition to assessing the costs of helping, people consider the benefits their assistance will provide. There is a good deal of evidence that people will help one another if they are certain they can do something truly useful. 58 For example, in one experiment, Robert Barron 59 showed that, when an individual was in obvious pain, and when the bystander knew his or her response could alleviate the suffering, then the greater the apparent pain, the more quickly the bystander responded. But when the bystander did not believe he or she could reduce the victim's pain, there was an inverse relationship between pain and speed of responding, that is, the greater the apparent pain, the more slowly the bystander responded. To make sense out of these results, we need to make use of the concept of empathy. In this case, our tendency to experience unpleasant physiological responses at the sight of another person in pain. The greater the victim's pain, the greater our unpleasant feeling. We can reduce this unpleasant feeling either by helping the victim or by removing ourselves psychologically from the situation. If there is clearly something we can do about it, we act quickly, especially when the victim is in great pain. If we believe there is nothing we can do about it, the greater is our tendency to turn away from it, especially if the victim is in great pain. Up to this point, we have been focusing on the considerations surrounding a decision to help a victim. As this discussion of empathy exemplifies, the bystander also considers the personal benefits and costs of not helping. The discomfort aroused by seeing a victim's conformity 55 plight can be assuaged if the witness can redefine the incident as a non-emergency or relinquish the responsibility for intervening. When it is easy to remove oneself from the situation, helping is reduced. Several factors, however, strengthen the connection the bystander feels with the victim and thereby discourage leaving. We have all heard anecdotes of people going to extraordinary lengths, entering burning buildings or stepping in front of moving cars, to save members of their family. We tend to feel more empathy and assume more responsibility when the victim is someone close to us. The connection can be more superficial than family ties. For instance, potential helpers render more assistance to those who exhibit attitudes similar to their own. In 1971, as protesters demonstrated in Washington against President Nixon's Vietnam policy, Peter Swadefeld and his colleagues staged an experiment to test the relationship between similarity of attitudes and willingness to help. They trained a young woman to approach individual demonstrators with a request to help her male friend, who was ill. Her ailing friend carried a sign reading either "Dump Nixon" or "Support Nixon." Demonstrators offered more assistance to a fellow protester carrying the anti-Nixon placard than to a seeming supporter of Nixon. Finally, as I mentioned when discussing the Yosemite camping incident and the subway experiments, helping is more likely when people share a sense of common fate. This sense of interdependence is easily disregarded in our society. The predominant explanation given by the 38 onlookers to the Genovese murder was "I didn't want to get involved." A note on the ethics of experiments. In their quest for knowledge, experimental social psychologists occasionally subject people to some fairly intense experiences. In this chapter alone, I have discussed experiments in which people have been led into conflict between the evidence of their own eyes and the unanimous judgments of other people, in which they have been ordered to deliver intense electric shocks to an apparently suffering victim, and in which scores of innocent people riding a subway have been forced to witness the apparent agony of a person in distress. These procedures raise serious ethical problems. A more complete treatment of ethics is presented in Chapter 9. Here, let it suffice to make two general points. First, it is the responsibility of all expert, 56 the social animal, mentors in this field to protect the experimental participant from all harm. The experimenter must take steps to ensure that participants leave the experimental situation in a frame of mind that is at least as sound as it was when they entered the experimental situation. This frequently requires post-experimental debriefing procedures that require more time and effort than the main body of the experiment. Given the ethical thin ice that experimenters must skate upon, why bother with these kinds of experiments at all? This brings me to the second point of ethics I want to emphasize at this time. For social psychologists, the ethical issue is not a one-sided affair. In a real sense, they are obligated to use their research skills to advance our knowledge and understanding of human behavior for the ultimate aim of human betterment. In short, social psychologists have an ethical responsibility to the society as a whole. They would be remiss in fulfilling this responsibility if they failed to conduct research to the best of their ability. Social psychologists face a dilemma when their general ethical responsibility to society conflicts with their more specific ethical responsibility to each individual experimental participant, and to compound the situation, the conflict is greatest when investigating such important issues as conformity, obedience, helping, and the like because, in general, the more important the issue, the greater the potential benefit for society. And the more likely it is that an individual participant will experience discomfort, anxiety, or upset. For a more complete treatment of this topic, the reader is directed to Chapter 9, Conformity 57, Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Published in Steinberg, The Labyrinth, 1960. The Saul Steinberg Foundation Artists' Rights Society, New York. 3. Mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. It is a truism to say that we live in an age of mass communication. The truism has never been more accurate. In the 21st century, the Internet has transformed the world into a global village. Indeed, this change has been so rapid, politicians have not quite adapted to the fact that the average citizen now has access to a wealth of information. For example, at a 2006 press conference, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld stated that no one ever said the war in Iraq would be easy. Within hours, thousands of citizens went online and called up a statement Rumsfeld had made 4 years earlier, on the eve of the Iraq invasion, to the effect that the war would be over within a few months. John McCain, who in 2008 ran a campaign for president that repeatedly extolled his virtues as a political maverick, made the curious claim in a 2010 interview that "I never considered myself a maverick." That same day, a flood of YouTube videos appeared on the internet displaying clip after clip of McCain calling himself a maverick. Entire population can be exposed to a similar diet of information as soon as it becomes available. Let me provide you with a few graphic examples of this phenomenon and some of its consequences. In 1977, American television presented its very first blockbuster miniseries. More than 130 million viewers tuned in to watch at least one of the segments of Roots, the ABC television network's production of Alex Haley's History of Several Generations of an African American Family in the United States. The show received widespread acclaim for promoting the awareness of Black history and for inspiring Blacks' pride in their heritage. 6 years later, ABC aired the day after, a made-for-TV movie that graphically depicted the aftermath of a nuclear attack on the United States. In November 1983, nearly 100 million U.S. households tuned in. The audience was far larger than our wildest predictions. Weeks before it was shown, the day after was the subject of numerous cover stories in national news magazines. Movie stars, physicists, and political leaders aired their views about the program and its potential impact. The day after clearly had an impact, even on those who had not actually watched the show but had merely heard some of the hype. After the movie aired, watchers and non-watchers alike thought more about nuclear war, thought nuclear war was more likely, felt that surviving such a war was less likely, and viewed survival as less positive. Moreover, both groups reported that they intended to work toward preventing a nuclear war by supporting a nuclear weapons freeze and engaging in other anti-nuclear activities. These effects were generally stronger for the watchers than the non-watchers. Amazingly, just 2 hours of primetime television had a major impact on most Americans, influencing both their attitudes and their intentions to do something constructive about the threat of nuclear war. A simple 2 hours of television can also have powerfully negative effects, preventing viewers from taking action. In 1974, CBS aired a film called Cry Rape. Essentially, the story made it clear that a rape victim who chooses to press charges against her attacker runs the risk of undergoing an ordeal that may be as harrowing as the rape itself. In this case, the rapist, exuding boyish innocence, presented a convincing argument to the effect that the woman had seduced him. During the next few weeks, there was a sharp decrease in the number of rapes reported by victims to police, apparently because victims, taking their cue from the television movie, feared the police would not believe them. 60 The Social Animal. In 1995, tens of millions of viewers sat transfixed in front of their TV sets for several months, watching the murder trial of O.J. Simpson. During that period, lawyers of every stripe paraded in front of the video cameras offering their expert opinions on every nuance of the proceedings. Millions of viewers were insatiable. They couldn't seem to get enough of the trial. When the verdict was finally announced and Mr. Simpson was found not guilty, we witnessed a vivid example of a powerful racial division in this country. Most blacks felt it was a just verdict, most whites felt it was a miscarriage of justice. It was as if white people and black people had been watching two different trials. And then, September 11th. How many times did TV viewers see the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center collapse? The images of the falling buildings, the shocked onlookers, the heroic rescue workers, and the grieving relatives remain embedded in the minds of most Americans and have had a major impact on our fear and anger at terrorists, our patriotism, our willingness to go to war, and alas, in some people, unwarranted prejudice against Muslims, attempts at persuasion. We live in an age of mass communication. Indeed, it can even be said that we live in an age characterized by attempts at mass persuasion. Every time we turn on the radio or television set, every time we open a book, magazine, or newspaper, or log on to the internet, someone is trying to educate us, to convince us to buy a product, to persuade us to vote for a candidate or to subscribe to some version of what is right, true, or beautiful. This aim is most obvious in advertising. Manufacturers of nearly identical products spend vast amounts of money to persuade us to buy the product in their package, but influence through the mass media need not be so blatant. The impact of Roots, The Day After, and the O.J. Simpson trial extended far beyond their most obvious effects as docudramas or real-life court dramas. This influence can be very subtle indeed, even unintentional, as the example of the film about rape aptly illustrates. Even when communicators are not making a direct attempt to sell us something, they can succeed in influencing the way we look at the world and the way we respond to important events in our lives. Mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 61. Let's look at something supposedly objective, like the news. Are the newscasters trying to sell us anything? Typically not. But those who produce television news exert a powerful influence on our opinions simply by determining which events are given exposure and how much exposure they are given. In 1991, a motorist named Rodney King was stopped for reckless driving. In the course of the arrest, he was savagely beaten by a group of Los Angeles policemen. By a fluke of luck, a resident of the neighborhood recorded the event on videotape. During the next several weeks, the tape was shown over and over again on TV screens across the nation. Subsequently, in the spring of 1992, when a jury found the police innocent of any wrongdoing, the inner city of Los Angeles erupted in the worst riot in American history. By the time peace was restored, 53 people had been killed, some 2,000 were seriously injured, and entire city blocks in south-central Los Angeles were in flames, resulting in over $1 billion in property damage. Needless to say, there were many causes of the riot. But certainly one of the triggers was the fact that people had seen that beating many times and therefore were in a position to be outraged by the verdict. Given the power of TV newscasts, it is reasonable to ask what factors determine which news items are selected for television newscasts. The answer is not a simple one, but one major factor is the need to attract viewers. Indeed, it has been said by no less an expert than the director of the British Broadcasting Corporation that television news is a form of entertainment. Recent studies suggest that when those in charge of news programming decide which news events to cover and which fraction of the miles of daily videotape to present to the public, they make their decisions, at least in part, on the basis of the entertainment value of their material. Film footage of a flooded city has much more entertainment value than footage of people building a levee to prevent such flooding. It is simply not very exciting to watch a construction project. And yet the levee may be more important news. Just as action events such as football games are more entertaining on television than quiet events such as chess matches, it is more likely that riots, bombings, earthquakes, massacres, and other violent acts will get more airtime than stories about people working to prevent violence. Thus, news telecasts tend to focus on the violent behavior of individuals, terrorists, murderers, protesters, strikers, or 62 the social animal, police, because action makes for more exciting viewing than does a portrayal of people behaving in a peaceful, orderly manner. Moreover, people tend to be drawn to the negative. Roger Johnson recently analyzed the content of television news programs, including the broadcasts of major and local networks for a period of 6 months. In terms of the number of stories and the amount of time devoted to the stories, violence, conflict, and human suffering dominated the news, accounting for more than 53% of the newscast. Moreover, Johnson found that the most violent stories were reported earliest in the broadcast, a choice that sends the implicit message that the violent stories were the most important news of the day. Johnson's analysis thus found truth in the old journalist's adage, if it bleeds, it leads. He found the bias to be especially strong in the local news, which devoted nearly 80% of the typical newscast to violent crime. Such coverage presents a distorted picture of the world, not because the people who run the news media are evil and trying to manipulate us, but simply because they are trying to entertain us and get us to tune in, and, in trying to entertain us, they may unwittingly influence us to believe that people behave far more violently now than ever before. This may cause us to be unhappy and even depressed about the temper of the times or the state of the nation. Ultimately, it may affect our vote, our desire to visit major urban centers, our attitudes about other nations, and so on. As we shall see in Chapter 6, it may actually cause people to behave more violently. Of course, some violent events are important and warrant a great deal of coverage. As I mentioned earlier, following the terrorist attack of September 11, most Americans sat glued to their TV sets because they wanted to know what was happening and they needed reassurance that the situation was under control. In the process, many of us saw the collapse of the Twin Towers dozens of times as the cable news channels gave that event round-the-clock coverage. How can we be sure that is what our citizens wanted at that time? In the 2 weeks following the attack, the number of people who tuned into CNN jumped 667%, and the New York Times sold 250,000 more newspapers on September 12 than it did on September 10. It is always good to be informed, and the media play an important role in keeping us informed. But there can be a downside to this kind of exposure, as well. Whether it is intentional or not, repeated, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 63. Vivid imagery of this sort shapes attitudes and opinions. The constant images of the collapsing Twin Towers, as well as the repetition of bellicose slogans on cable news channels, contributed to the arousal of intense emotions in viewers and doubtless served to reduce the possibility of any real debate about the wisdom of invading Iraq. Moreover, 1 year after September 11, 2001, when President George W. Bush somehow managed to link Saddam Hussein with the al-Qaeda terrorists, his request for the authority to invade Iraq sailed through Congress with hardly a murmur of opposition. This is a social psychology book, not a political treatise. I am not commenting on the wisdom of these policies. What I am suggesting is that, in a democracy, important decisions, like whether to go to war, benefit from rational public debate. Strong emotions, such as those stirred up by the news media, often get in the way of rational decision-making, as Hermann Göring, one of Adolf Hitler's top aides, said before being sentenced to death at Nuremberg. The people can always be brought to do the bidding of the leaders. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked, and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Media contagion. The power of the media is perhaps best illustrated by a phenomenon known as emotional contagion. For example, in October 1982, when 7 people in the Chicago area died after taking extra-strength Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide, the tragedy was widely publicized by the national news media. Indeed, for several days it was difficult to turn on the television or radio or to pick up a newspaper without learning about the Tylenol poisonings. Of course, it was both tragic and bizarre, and therefore very good copy. The effects of this prominent coverage were immediate. Similar poisonings were reported in cities across the country, involving the contamination of mouthwash, eye drops, nasal spray, soda pop, and even hot dogs, dramatically billed as copycat poisonings. These poisonings, in turn, received widespread media attention. The public reaction took on all the properties of a spiral. Many people panicked, seeking medical aid for burns and poisonings when they suffered from no more than common rashes, sore throats, and stomach aches. False alarms. 64. The social animal outnumbered actual cases of product tampering by 7 to 1. Because these events occurred just prior to Halloween, worried officials in scores of communities banned trick-or-treating, fearing that many individuals might mimic the murders by contaminating children's candy. The initial Chicago poisonings were almost certainly the work of one person. Subsequent events were caused by the publicity given to the Chicago poisonings, but the belief was spread that the wave of poisoning constituted an epidemic without a cure, in the words of one news service, and was itself the symptom of a sick society, a country going crazy. Many newspapers found themselves in the ironic position of first sensationalizing the poisoning incidents and then sensationalizing the subsequent critical comments of media experts discussing the disastrous consequences of such publicity. A few years later, 4 teenagers in New Jersey made a suicide pact and then carried out their plan. Within a week of this multiple suicide, 2 teenagers in the Midwest were found dead under similar circumstances. Media reports no doubt spotlighted the confusion and grief surrounding teenage suicide, but is it possible that the media's coverage of these tragedies actually inspired copycat suicides? According to sociologist David Phillips, the answer is a qualified yes. Phillips and his colleagues studied suicide rates among teenagers following network television news or feature stories about suicide. Their research tracked fluctuations in teenage suicides by comparing suicide rates before the stories with rates after the stories. Within a week of the broadcasts, the increase in teenage suicides was far greater than could be explained by chance alone. Furthermore, the more coverage devoted by major television networks to suicide, the greater the subsequent increase in suicides among teenagers. The increase is held, even when the researchers took other possible causes into account. Thus, the most likely explanation for the increase in teenage suicides following media publicity is that such publicity actually triggers subsequent copycat suicides. Copycat suicides are not something peculiar to teenagers. In another study on the effects of highly publicized suicides, Phillips chose to examine fatal car crashes. Some people, trying to save family members from the trauma of a suicide, will choose to kill themselves in car crashes designed to look like accidents. These suicides should show up on official records as single car, one passenger fatal accidents. Phillips, Mass Communication, Propaganda, and Persuasion 65, reasoned that after a publicized suicide, there should be a dramatic increase in these types of accidents, and that the victims should be similar in some respect to the publicized suicide victim. This is exactly what he found after examining highway patrol records both before and after highly publicized suicides. There were no changes in multiple car accidents or single car accidents with passengers, and the victims in these accidents did not resemble the publicized suicide victims. There was, however, an increase in suicide-type accidents, and the victims' ages were highly correlated with the age of the publicized suicide victim. Again, the most likely explanation for these findings is that the publicity of one suicide incited others to take their own lives. The Tylenol poisonings and copycat suicides were newsworthy. I am not suggesting that the media created these events or that they should not have been reported. Rather, I am underlining the obvious fact that selective emphasis puts the media in the position of determining subsequent events, not simply reporting them. Again, this form of influence is probably unintentional. The news media are not trying to foster violence or create the illusion that most people are cruel. But the pervasiveness of electronic media cannot be overstated. In fact, sometimes the role of the media in reporting an event becomes more newsworthy than the event itself. For example, let's look at the Beirut hostage crisis of 1985. In which 153 passengers and crew on a TWA jet were held captive by Shiite terrorists. Television cameras offered viewers back home around-the-clock coverage of all aspects of the crisis, important and trivial alike. There were press conferences held by the terrorists, press conferences held by the hostages, intimate shots of anguished families, demands, counter-demands, pistol wavings, outrageous statements, luncheon menus, and so on. The television camera crews did everything but follow the hostages into the restrooms. At one point, it was suggested that the electronic media might be prolonging the ordeal by giving so much free publicity to the Shiite cause. So what did the television networks do? They televised a series of panel discussions by pundits about the role of the media in such a situation. The message became the media, in its endlessness. This series of events reminded me of a brand of table salt, popular when I was a kid. On the box was a picture of a little girl holding up a box of the table salt on which there was a picture of a little girl holding up a box of the table salt on which there was a picture of a little girl. 66 The social animal. With the advent of 24-hour cable news, this sort of ironic exercise has become commonplace. In 2010, on his MSNBC news show, Ed Schultz recently spent a significant portion of the hour railing at the media for focusing attention on the strange behavior of an unknown pastor in Georgia who planned to mark the anniversary of the September 11 attacks by publicly burning the Quran. Schultz ranted at length about how, by drawing attention to the pastor's anti-Islamic behavior, the media were complicit in provoking acts of Islamic terrorism against American troops stationed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Effectiveness of media appeals. What about intentional persuasion? How credible and effective are obvious attempts to package and sell products through the mass media? The prima facie evidence suggests that they are extremely effective. Why else would corporations and political parties spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year trumpeting their products? Moreover, as parents, most of us have seen our children being seduced by toy commercials that artfully depict the drabbest toys in an irresistible way. Similarly, a child watching the Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, or the Cartoon Network is deluged by fast-paced ads for cereal, junk food, and candy. The aim is to get kids to demand that their parents buy them the products they have seen in the commercials, and it seems to work. More than 90% of preschool children asked for toys or food they saw advertised on television, according to a survey of their mothers. 12 In fact, almost 2/3 of the mothers reported hearing their children sing commercial jingles they learned from television, most by the age of 3. Most children catch on after a time. My own children, after several disappointments, developed a healthy skepticism about the truthfulness of these commercials. Indeed, one survey 13 found that only 12% of 6th graders believed television commercials told the truth all or most of the time. By the 10th grade, only 4% felt they were truthful even most of the time. This kind of skepticism is common among adults, as well. A public opinion poll showed that the overwhelming majority of the adult respondents believe television commercials contain mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 67. Untruthful arguments. Moreover, the results indicate that the more educated the person, the greater the skepticism, and further, people who are skeptical believe their skepticism makes them immune to persuasion. This might lead us to conclude that the mere fact of knowing that a communicator is biased serves to protect us from being influenced by the message. This is not true. Simply because we think we are immune to persuasion does not necessarily mean we are immune. In the case of many consumer products, the public tends to buy a specific brand for no other reason than the fact that it is heavily advertised. Let's look at the headache remedy business. Daryl Bem 14 provides us with an interesting analysis of our susceptibility to television commercials even when we know they are biased. A well-known brand of aspirin advertises itself as 100% pure aspirin. The commercial goes on to say that government tests have shown that no other pain remedy is stronger or more effective than brand A. What the maker didn't bother to mention is that the government test actually showed that no brand was any weaker or less effective than any of the others. In other words, all tested brands were equal, except in price, that is. For the privilege of popping brand A, consumers pay approximately 3 times the price of an equally effective but unadvertised brand. Another product proclaims it uses the special ingredient that doctors recommend. By reading the label, we discover the mystery ingredient to be good old inexpensive aspirin. Several pharmaceutical companies also market extra-strength varieties of arthritic pain formulations. You will pay a premium price for these products, but are they worth it? Actually, their extra strength comes from extra aspirin, along with a dose of caffeine. Taking additional aspirin would be less expensive, but it sounds great in the ads. Not one, but a combination of medically proven ingredients in an extra-strength formula. Such blatant attempts at mass persuasion seem pitifully obvious, yet tremendous numbers of consumers apparently set aside their skepticism even though they know the message is an obvious attempt to sell a product. Of course, there may be a basic difference between susceptibility to aspirin commercials and susceptibility to commercials for presidential candidates. When we are dealing with identical or very similar products, mere familiarity may make a huge difference. 68 The social animal. Robert Zions 15 has shown that, all other things being equal, the more familiar an item is, the more attractive it is. This explains why people prefer faces they've seen 10 times to equally attractive faces they've seen only 5 times. 16 It also explains why people prefer words that contain the same letters as those in their names. 17 And why we prefer pictures of ourselves that are backward, whereas our friends prefer the non-mirror image. 18 Unless there is something inherently noxious about a stimulus, the more we are exposed to it, the more we will like it. Suppose I walk into a grocery store looking for laundry detergent. I go to the detergent section, and I am staggered by the wide array of brand names. Because it doesn't matter too much to me which one I buy, I may simply reach for the most familiar one, and, chances are, it is familiar because I've heard and seen the name on television commercials over and over again. If this is the case, then sudden increases in television exposure should produce dramatic changes in familiarity and, perhaps, in sales. And that seems to be the case. For example, several years ago, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company conducted a nationwide poll to find out how well the public recognized its name. It came out 34th among insurance companies. 2 weeks later, the company repeated the poll. This time it came out third in name familiarity. What caused this amazing leap from obscurity to fame? 2 weeks and $1 million worth of advertising on television. Familiarity does not necessarily mean sales, but the two are frequently linked, as evidenced by the fact that En Route beer boosted its share of the market from 15% to 50% after 6 months of television advertising. But is voting for a presidential candidate the same kind of decision as choosing toothpaste or root beer? The answer, again, is a qualified yes. Several years ago, Joseph Grush and his colleagues 19 found that, by and large, the congressional candidates who spent the most money typically received the most votes. More recently, Michael Fow and his colleagues 20 have shown that spot television commercials are by far the most effective determinants of how people vote. Moreover, spot commercials on TV are especially effective when the campaign centers on a highly charged issue that arouses strong emotions in voters. For a compelling illustration, let's go back to the 1988 presidential campaign between George H.W. Bush and Mass Communication, Propaganda, and Persuasion 69, Michael Dukakis, former governor of Massachusetts. In the summer of 1988, Bush trailed far behind Dukakis in the race for the presidency. Many observers were convinced that Dukakis's lead was insurmountable. Within a few short months, however, the lead had all but evaporated and, on election day, Bush won handily. A number of political analysts credit Willie Horton with playing a major role in this turnaround. Indeed, Time magazine went so far as to refer to Willie Horton as George Bush's most valuable player. 21 Who was Willie Horton? He was not one of Bush's advisors, nor was he a major financial contributor to the Bush campaign. Indeed, the two men had never met. Willie Horton was a convicted felon who had been released from a Massachusetts prison before the end of his term as part of a furlough program. While on furlough, Horton escaped to Maryland. There, he raped a woman in view of her male companion, whom he had wounded and tied to a chair. Michael Dukakis was governor of Massachusetts when Horton's furlough was granted. Claiming that Dukakis was soft on crime, Bush ran a series of television ads showing the mugshot of a scowling Willie Horton and depicting criminals going in and out of prison through a revolving door. These ads struck a chord with many Americans who had legitimate fears of street crime and who strongly suspected that the criminal justice system favored criminals at the expense of victims. Moreover, the fact that Willie Horton was black, and that his victims were white, was not lost on most viewers. 22. How did Dukakis fight back? With facts and figures, he pointed out that Massachusetts was only one of many states with furlough programs and that even the federal government furloughed inmates from its prisons. In addition, he noted, furlough programs were generally very effective. For example, in 1987, 53,000 inmates received more than 200,000 furloughs and only a small percentage got into trouble. 23 Dukakis also pointed out that, typically, furloughs were granted to convicts who were near the end of their terms, and that the furloughs were intended to orient them to the outside world. He insisted that the whole issue was a contrivance, that, if elected, George Bush had no intention of changing the furlough system. Are you getting bored yet? So were the voters. If Michael Dukakis had had a social psychologist on his staff, he would have received better advice. As Anthony Pratkanis and I have pointed out, 24/70 The social animal, when people are scared and angry, facts and figures alone are not very convincing. They can be effective if they are tied to solutions to problems the voters are deeply concerned about. In the 1992 and 1996 presidential elections, candidate Bill Clinton kept the attention of the American people focused on one overriding issue, the state of the economy, and did not allow himself to be sidetracked by emotional issues on which there was no real difference between the candidates. 25. In the congressional elections of 2010, the most successful candidates were those who capitalized on the public's anger at the government bailouts of the Wall Street investment banks. Candidates had a harder time when they attempted a more reasoned approach, such as explaining the complex economic rationale for those bailouts. Education or propaganda. Aspirin commercials are obvious attempts to sell something at a high price by intentionally misleading the audience. They can be considered propaganda. Selling a presidential candidate, however, is much more complicated. Thus, the devices used by political consultants and speechwriters to display their candidate in a favorable manner could conceivably be considered as education, an attempt to educate the public on the policies and virtues of the candidate by allowing him to present his views as clearly, efficiently, and articulately as possible. What is the difference between propaganda and education? The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language defines propaganda as the systematic propagation of a given doctrine and education as the act of imparting knowledge or skill. Again, we could all agree that aspirin ads are propaganda designed to promote the sale of certain brands. But what about television, which often depicts women, old people, and minorities in stereotyped roles? Or, more subtly, what about the vast majority of high school history textbooks that until recently totally ignored the contributions made by blacks and other minorities, and now tend to pay mere lip service to these contributions? Is this simply imparting knowledge? The problem of distinguishing between education and propaganda can be even subtler still. Let us look at arithmetic as taught, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 71. In the public schools. What could be more educational? By that I mean, what could be more pure, objective, factual, and untainted by doctrine? Watch out, do you remember the examples used in your elementary school arithmetic text? Most of the examples dealt with buying, selling, renting, working for wages, and computing interest. As Zimbardo, Ebsen, and Moslick 26 point out, these examples do more than simply reflect the capitalistic system in which the education is occurring. They systematically endorse the system, legitimize it, and, by implication, suggest it is the natural and normal way. As a way of illustrating multiplication and percentages, the textbook might have Mr. Jones borrowing $15,000 at 9% interest to purchase a new car. Would this example be used in a society that felt it was sinful to charge interest, as early Christian societies believed? Would this example be used in a society that believed people should not seek possessions they can't afford? I am not suggesting it is wrong or immoral to use these kinds of illustrations in arithmetic books. I am merely pointing out that they are a form of propaganda and that it might be useful to recognize them as such. In practice, whether a person regards a particular course of instruction as educational or propagandistic depends, to a large extent, on his or her values. Reflect, for a moment, on a film about drug abuse my children were required to see in their high school. At one point, the film mentioned that many hardcore narcotics addicts began by sampling marijuana. I'm certain that most school officials would probably regard the presentation of this piece of factual knowledge as a case of imparting knowledge, and most marijuana users would probably regard it as the systematic propagation of a given doctrine, that is, the implication that marijuana leads to the use of harder drugs. By the same token, consider the topic of sex education in the schools as viewed by a member of the Christian right, on the one hand, or by the editor of Playboy magazine, on the other hand. This is not to say that all communications are drastically slanted and one-sided. Rather, when we are dealing with emotionally charged issues upon which people disagree, it is probably impossible to construct a communication that people on both sides of the issue would agree is fair and impartial. I will present a more detailed discussion of communication as viewed through the eye of the beholder in the next chapter. For now, it is important to note that, whether we call it propaganda or education, persuasion is, 72, the social animal, a reality. It won't go away if we ignore it. We should therefore attempt to understand it by analyzing the experimental literature on persuasion. Two major routes to persuasion. When confronted with a persuasive argument, Do we think deeply about it or do we accept it without much thought? This question underlies much of our understanding of persuasion. According to Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, 27, we are inclined to think deeply about an issue if it is one that is relevant and important to us. In these circumstances, we tend to give the argument careful scrutiny, but sometimes, even if the issue is important, we may not process an argument carefully, because we are distracted or tired, or because the communication is presented in a way that lulls us into acceptance. Petty and Cacioppo argue that there are essentially two ways that people are persuaded, centrally or peripherally. The central route to persuasion involves weighing arguments and considering relevant facts and figures, thinking about issues in a systematic fashion and coming to a decision. In contrast, the peripheral route to persuasion is less judicious. Rather than relying on a careful process of weighing and considering the strength of arguments, the person responds to simple, often irrelevant cues that suggest the rightness, wrongness, or attractiveness of an argument without giving it much thought. For example, considering arguments about how to remedy an ailing economy has to do with the central route. Getting scared and angry by the image of Willie Horton has to do with the peripheral route. Likewise, when a man decides to buy a particular computer because the ad depicts it as having the kind of user-friendliness, processing speed, memory, and data storage capacity that he needs, he is being moved by the logic of the argument. This is the central route. But, if he decides to buy the computer because his favorite movie star owns the identical model, he is being moved by issues irrelevant to the product. This is the peripheral route. It should be noted that few persuasive appeals are purely central or peripheral. Most contain elements aimed at both routes to persuasion. A well-known ad campaign, for example, shows two individuals, one playing the role of a Macintosh computer, the other a PC. The Mac is played by Justin Long, who is cool and handsome, a clear, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 73. Contrast to John Hodgman, Long's older, fatter, and stodgier counterpart, who represents the PC. The central content of the ad, the technological superiority of the Mac, is enhanced by these peripheral cues. Lawyers and politicians often make great use of the combination of arguments and peripheral cues. In 1995, the murder trial of O.J. Simpson riveted the nation. Millions of viewers tuned in to see the Hall of Fame running back and his dream team of lawyers fight the charges that Simpson had brutally murdered his ex-wife and her friend. In one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, the prosecutor asked Simpson to try on the blood-stained gloves worn by the murderer. The gloves fit Simpson very tightly. In his summation, Simpson's lead attorney, Johnny Cochran, alluded to that moment, making a theme of it, and in so doing, adding a persuasive peripheral cue. Cochran repeatedly intoned, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." The statement was persuasive, but not because of the argument's logic. After all, it is certainly possible to commit murder wearing tight gloves. Rather, the statement had power because when people are evaluating the quality of an argument, they can be influenced by the way things are phrased. In Cochran's case, his rhyme gave the statement a ring of truth. Research by Matthew McGlone 28 reveals our susceptibility to such tactics. He found that college students were more persuaded by unfamiliar aphorisms that rhyme, than the same ideas presented in non-rhyming form. The peripheral route to persuasion can be surprisingly subtle, yet surprisingly effective. In recent years, the science of choosing the right words has become an essential tool of political campaigns. For example, most Americans are in favor of taxing individuals on wealth they inherit from their parents. In other words, most of us support what used to be called the estate tax. However, public opinion about the estate tax changed dramatically when its name was changed by a clever political consultant named Frank Luntz. Luntz's Research 29 suggested that people could be turned against the tax law if politicians began referring to it as a death tax, which conjures the image of being unfairly penalized for dying. Likewise, when people consider an educational policy named No Child Left Behind, it can sound so heartwarming that the defects of the policy escape careful scrutiny. Politicians and political action groups rue, 74. The social animal. Timely give proposed policies labels that belie the actual content of the legislation. Recently, the 2009 Health Care Reform Bill nearly failed in Congress. One of the most effective attacks upon it came when a politician charged that a provision in the bill would allow doctors and insurance companies to decide the fate of patients with serious illnesses. In their attack on the bill, these decision-making meetings were given the scary name death panels, implying that strangers could decide, as one opponent of the bill put it, to pull the plug on grandma. In reality, the provision simply required that insurance companies pay for consultation between patients and their doctors to consider options for terminally ill patients, a far cry from the image conjured by the death panel nickname. Similarly, the producers of high-fructose corn syrup, a low-cost alternative to sugar found in soft drinks and thousands of processed foods, have come under attack for the alleged role of the sweetener in the epidemics of obesity and diabetes, fearing that their product has become something of a dirty word, and that food producers may switch to alternative sweeteners. The Corn Refiners Association decided in 2010 to take bold action to protect their embattled product. What did they do? They changed its name. Hereafter, high-fructose corn syrup will be called corn sugar, as we shall see repeatedly throughout this book. Whether true or false, the pictures that pop into our heads can have enormous influence over our beliefs, feelings, and behaviors, and these pictures depend greatly on the specific words we use to label them. What are the key factors that can increase the effectiveness of a communication or persuasive attempt? Basically, three classes of variables are important: the source of the communication, the nature of the communication, and characteristics of the audience. Put most simply, who says what to whom? We will look at each of these separately. The source of the communication, credibility. Picture the following scene: your doorbell rings, and when you answer it, you find a middle-aged man in a loud, checkered sports jacket. His tie is loose, his collar is frayed, his pants need mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 75. Ironing. He needs a shave, and his eyes keep looking off to the side and over your head as he talks to you. He is carrying a small can in his hand with a slot on the top, and he's trying to convince you to contribute a few dollars to a charitable organization you've never heard of. Although his actual pitch sounds fairly reasonable, what is the possibility of his succeeding in prying loose some of your money? Now let's turn back the clock a few minutes. You open your door in response to the ringing of the doorbell. And standing there is a middle-aged man in a conservative business suit, well-tailored and well-pressed. He looks you squarely in the eye, introduces himself as a vice president of the City National Bank, and asks you to contribute a few dollars to a charitable organization, using exactly the same words as the fellow in the loud, checkered jacket. Would you be more likely to contribute some money? I was struck by this phenomenon many years ago when I saw the poet Allen Ginsberg on one of the late-night talk shows. Ginsberg was among the most popular poets of the so-called Beat generation. His poem Howl had shocked and stimulated the literary establishment in the 1950s. On the talk show, Ginsberg was at it again, having just finished boasting about his homosexuality. He was talking about the generation gap. The camera panned in. He was fat, bearded, and looked a trifle wild-eyed. Long hair grew in unruly patches from the sides of his otherwise bald head. He was wearing a tie-dyed t-shirt with a hole in it and a few strands of beads. Although he was talking earnestly, and, in my opinion, very sensibly, about the problems of the young, the studio audience was laughing. They seemed to be treating him like a clown. It dawned on me that, in all probability, the vast majority of the people at home, lying in bed watching the poet from between their feet, could not possibly take him seriously, no matter how sensible his message and no matter how earnestly he delivered it. His appearance was probably over-determining the audience's reaction. The scientist in me longed to substitute the conservative-looking banker in the neatly pressed business suit for the wild-eyed poet and have him move his lips while Ginsberg said the same words off-camera. My guess is that, under these circumstances, Ginsberg's message would have been well received. No need. Similar experiments have already been done. Indeed, speculations about the effects of prestige on persuasion are ancient. 76. The social animal. Earlier than 300 years BC, Aristotle, the world's first published social psychologist, wrote, "We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. This is true generally whatever the question is, and absolutely true where exact certainty is impossible and opinions are divided. It is not true, as some writers assume in their treatises on rhetoric, that the personal goodness revealed by the speaker contributes nothing to his power of persuasion. On the contrary, his character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion he possesses." 30. It required some 2,300 years for Aristotle's observation to be put to a rigorous scientific test. This was accomplished by Karl Hovland and Walter Weiss. 31. What these investigators did was very simple. They presented large numbers of people with a communication that argued a particular point of view, for example, that building atomic-powered submarines was a feasible undertaking. Some of the people were informed that the argument was made by a person possessing a great deal of credibility. For others, the same argument was attributed to a source with low credibility. Specifically, the argument that atomic-powered submarines could be built in the near future was attributed to J. Robert Oppenheimer, a nationally known and highly respected atomic physicist, or to Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, a publication infamous for its lack of objectivity and truthfulness. A large percentage of the people who were told that the communication came from Oppenheimer changed their opinions. They then believed more strongly in the feasibility of atomic submarines. Very few of those who read the identical communication attributed to Pravda shifted their opinions in the direction of the communication. This same phenomenon has received repeated confirmations by several different investigators using a wide variety of topics and attributing the communications to a wide variety of communicators. Careful experiments have shown that a judge of the juvenile court is better than most people at swaying opinion about juvenile delinquency, that a famous poet and critic can sway opinion about the merits of a poem, and that a medical journal can sway opinion about mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 77. Whether antihistamines should be dispensed without a prescription. What do the physicist, the judge, the poet, and the medical journal have that Pravda doesn't have? That is, what factor makes the difference in their effectiveness? Aristotle said we believe good men, by which he meant people of high moral caliber. Hovland and Weiss use the term credible, which removes the moral connotations present in the Aristotelian definition. Oppenheimer, a juvenile court judge, and the poet are credible, that is, they are not necessarily good, but they are both expert and trustworthy. It makes sense to allow yourself to be influenced by communicators who are trustworthy and who know what they are talking about. It makes sense for people to be influenced by J. Robert Oppenheimer when he is voicing an opinion about atomic power, and it makes sense for people to be influenced by T.S. Eliot when he is talking about poetry. These are expert, trustworthy people, but not all people are equally influenced by the same communicator. Indeed, the same communicator may be regarded by some people as possessing high credibility and by others as possessing low credibility. Moreover, certain peripheral attributes of the communicator may loom large for some members of the audience. Such attributes can serve to make a given communicator either remarkably effective or remarkably ineffective. This phenomenon was forcefully demonstrated in an experiment I performed in collaboration with Burton Golden, 32, in which we presented 6th graders with a speech extolling the usefulness and importance of arithmetic. The communicator was introduced either as a prize-winning engineer from a prestigious university or as someone who washed dishes for a living. As one might expect, the engineer was far more effective at influencing the youngsters' opinions than the dishwasher. This finding is consistent with previous research. In itself, it is obvious and not very interesting, but, in addition, we varied the race of the communicator. In some of the trials the communicator was white, in others, black. Several weeks prior to the experiment, the children had filled out a questionnaire designed to measure the degree of their prejudice against black people. The results were striking. Among those children who were most prejudiced against blacks, The black engineer was less influential than the white engineer, although both delivered the same speech. Moreover, among those children who were least prejudiced against blacks, the black engineer was more influential than the white engineer. It seems, 78 the social animal, unreasonable that a peripheral attribute such as skin color would affect a person's credibility. It might be argued that, in a purely rational world, a prestigious engineer should be able to influence sixth graders about the importance of arithmetic regardless of the color of his or her skin, but apparently this is not a purely rational world. Depending upon listeners' attitudes toward blacks, they were either more influenced or less influenced by a black communicator than by an otherwise identical white communicator. This kind of behavior is not very adaptive. If the quality of your life depends on the extent to which you allow a communication about arithmetic to influence your opinion, the expertise of the communicator would seem to be the most reasonable factor to heed. To the extent that other factors decrease or increase your susceptibility to persuasion on an issue irrelevant to such factors, you are behaving in a maladaptive manner. But advertisers bank on this kind of maladaptive behavior and often count on irrelevant factors to increase a spokesperson's credibility. For example, since television was in its infancy, actors who have played the role of doctors in TV dramas show up regularly on commercials peddling such products as aspirin and cold medicine. Such peripheral aspects of the communicator are often emphasized in commercials. Frequently they are the only aspects of the communicator the viewer is able to perceive. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, one of the most persistent peddlers of breakfast food was the former Olympic decathlon champion Bob Richards, who was probably far more effective at selling Wheaties than some learned professor of nutrition, no matter how expert he or she might have been. In the 1970s, Richards was replaced by another gold medal decathlon champion, Bruce Jenner. How effective are these people? We cannot be sure, but when Bruce Jenner was finally replaced in the 1980s, the Wheaties people again decided not to use a nutritionist and hired Mary Lou Retton, an Olympic gymnastics gold medalist, and there was no real surprise when the manufacturer of Wheaties subsequently hired such amazing athletes as Alex Rodriguez, Michael Phelps, and LeBron James to appear on the box. Apparently, whoever is in charge of selling Wheaties to the masses is convinced that athletes are effective communicators. Is this conviction justified? Will people be influenced by an ad just because a prominent sports personality is involved? Even if we, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 79, admire the skill such athletes display on the playing field, can we really trust them to tell us the truth about the products they endorse? After all, we all know that the sports star peddling a particular brand of breakfast cereal or athletic shoes is getting paid handsomely for his or her endorsement. My guess is that most of us would be quick to say, "No way, I'm not going to eat Wheaties or buy Nikes just because A-Rod says he eats Wheaties and favors Nikes." Maybe other people might be persuaded to run out and buy certain products just because a sports figure tells them to. But I certainly wouldn't trust even my favorite player's advice on how to spend my hard-earned cash. But can people really predict their own behavior? Before answering, let's take a closer look at the factor of trust. Increasing trustworthiness. Clearly, trust is an important factor in determining whether a communicator will be effective. For example, it may be that the crucial reason the more prejudiced sixth graders in the Aronson and Golden experiment were less influenced by the black engineer than by the white engineer was that they simply did not trust blacks. If this is true, then if we could offer the audience clear, independent evidence that a person is trustworthy, that person should be a very effective communicator. How might communicators make themselves seem clearly trustworthy to us? One way is to argue against their own self-interest. If people have nothing to gain by convincing us, we will trust them and they will be more effective. An illustration may be helpful. Suppose a habitual criminal, recently convicted as a smuggler and peddler of heroin, was delivering a communication on the abuses of the U.S. judicial system. Would he influence you? Probably not. Most people would probably regard him as unattractive and untrustworthy. He seems clearly outside of the Aristotelian definition of a good man, but suppose he was arguing that criminal justice was too lenient, that criminals almost always beat the rap if they have a smart lawyer, and that even if criminals are convicted, the sentences normally meted out are too soft. Would he influence you? I'm certain he would. In fact, I performed this very experiment in collaboration with Elaine Walster and Darcy Abrahams, 33, and it confirmed our hypothesis. In the actual experiment, we presented our participants with a newspaper clipping of an interview between 80 the social animal, a news reporter, and Joe the Shoulder Napolitano, who was identified in the manner described above. In one experimental condition, Joe the Shoulder argued for stricter courts and more severe sentences. In another condition, he argued that courts should be more lenient and sentences less severe. We also ran a parallel set of conditions in which the same statements were attributed to a respected public official. When Joe the Shoulder argued for more lenient courts, he was totally ineffective. Indeed, he actually caused the participants' opinions to change slightly in the opposite direction, but when he argued for stricter, more powerful courts, he was extremely effective, as effective as the respected public official delivering the same argument. This study demonstrates that Aristotle was not completely correct. A communicator can be an unattractive, immoral person and still be effective, as long as it is clear that he or she has nothing to gain by persuading us. Why was Joe the Shoulder so effective in our experiment? Let's take a closer look. Most people would not be surprised to hear a known convict arguing in favor of a more lenient criminal justice system. Their knowledge of the criminal's background and self-interest would lead them to expect such a message. When they receive the opposite communication, however, these expectations are disconfirmed. To make sense of this contradiction, the members of the audience might conclude that the convict had reformed, or they could entertain the notion that the criminal is under some kind of pressure to make the anti-crime statements, in the absence of any evidence to substantiate these suppositions. However, another explanation becomes more reasonable. Maybe the truth of the issue is so compelling that, even though it apparently contradicts his background and self-interest, the spokesman sincerely believes in the position he espouses. Further evidence for this phenomenon comes from a more recent experiment. Alice Eagley and her colleagues 34 presented students with a description of a dispute between business interests and environmental groups over a company that was polluting a river. The students then read a statement about the issue. In some conditions, the spokesman was described as having a business background and was said to be speaking to a group of businessmen. In others, his background and audience were varied, thereby altering mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 81. The participants' expectations about his message. The results supported the reasoning presented above. When the message conflicted with their expectations, listeners perceived the communicator as being more sincere, and they were more persuaded by his statement. For example, it's hard to imagine a more convincing spokesperson for an anti-smoking campaign than someone whose fortune was made off the habits of millions of U.S. smokers. In fact, Patrick Reynolds, who inherited millions of dollars from the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, founded by his grandfather, took a strong public stand against smoking and encouraged victims of smoking-related illnesses to file lawsuits against tobacco companies. 35. The trustworthiness of a person can also be increased if the audience is absolutely certain the person is not trying to influence them. Suppose a stockbroker calls you up and gives you a hot tip on a particular stock. Will you buy? It's hard to be sure. On the one hand, the broker is probably an expert, and this might influence you to buy. On the other hand, the broker has something to gain by giving you this tip, and this could lower her effectiveness. But suppose you happen to overhear her telling her close friend that a particular stock was about to rise. Because she was obviously not trying to influence you, you might be more readily influenced. Many years ago, the non-hypothetical brokerage firm E.F. Hutton incorporated this very scenario into a series of highly successful television commercials. The commercial opens with a shot of two people engaged in private conversation in a noisy, crowded restaurant. When one person begins to pass on some stock advice from E. F. Hutton, a sudden hush falls over the room and everyone, waiters, diners, busboys, strains toward the speaker to overhear the tip. When E. F. Hutton talks, says the announcer, people listen. The implication is clear, everyone in the restaurant is getting in on advice that wasn't intended for them, and the information is all the more valuable as a result. When communicators are not trying to influence us, their potential to do so increases. This is exactly what Elaine Walster and Leon Festinger 36 discovered a few years before the Hutton commercial appeared. In their experiment, they staged a conversation between two graduate students in which one of them expressed his expert opinion on an issue. An undergraduate was allowed to overhear this conversation. In 1x82 The Social Animal, Their Mental Condition, it was clear to the participant that the graduate students were aware of his presence in the next room. Therefore, the participant knew that anything being said could conceivably be directed at him with the intention of influencing his opinion. In the other condition, the situation was arranged so that the participant believed the graduate students were unaware of his presence in the next room. In this condition, the participant's opinion changed significantly more in the direction of the opinion expressed by the graduate students. Attractiveness. Where do these findings leave Alex Rodriguez or LeBron James urging us to eat Wheaties or wear Nikes? Clearly, they are trying to influence us. Moreover, they are operating in their own self-interest. When we take a close look at the situation, it's clear that Wheaties and Nike are paying these athletes a huge amount of money to hawk their products. We expect them to recommend these products, and we know they want us to see the commercial. These factors should make them less trustworthy. But does that make them less effective? Not necessarily. Although most of us might not trust the sincerity of the endorsers, that does not mean we don't buy the products they endorse. Another crucial factor determining the effectiveness of communicators is how attractive or likable they are, regardless of their overall expertise or trustworthiness. Some years ago, Judson Mills and I did a simple laboratory experiment demonstrating that a beautiful woman, simply because she was beautiful, could have a major impact on the opinions of an audience on a topic wholly irrelevant to her beauty, and furthermore, that her impact was greatest when she openly expressed a desire to influence the audience. 37 Then, Alice Eagley, Shelley Chaikin, and colleagues carried out experiments that not only replicated the finding that more likable communicators are more persuasive but went on to show that attractive sources are expected to support desirable positions. 38 It appears that we associate the attractiveness of the communicator with the desirability of the message. We are influenced by people we like. Where our liking for a communicator is involved, we behave as though we were trying to please that source. Accordingly, the more that communicator wants to change our opinions, the more we change them, but only about mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 83 Trivial issues. In other words, athletes can influence our cereal choices and beautiful women can get us to agree with them on an abstract topic, whether or not we are willing to admit it, but it is unlikely that they could influence us to vote for their presidential candidate or to adopt their position on the morality of abortion. To summarize this section, we might list these phenomena. Our opinions are influenced by individuals who are both expert and trustworthy. A communicator's trustworthiness can be increased if he or she argues a position apparently opposed to his or her self-interest. A communicator's trustworthiness can be increased if he or she does not seem to be trying to influence our opinion, at least where trivial opinions and behaviors are concerned. If we like and can identify with a person, his or her opinions and behaviors will influence us more than their content would ordinarily warrant. Again, where trivial opinions and behaviors are concerned, if we like a person, we tend to be influenced even if it is clear that he or she is trying to influence us and stands to profit by doing so. The nature of the communication, the manner in which a communication is stated plays an important role in determining its effectiveness. There are several ways in which communications can differ from one another. I have selected 5 ways I consider to be among the most important. Is a communication more persuasive if it is designed to appeal to the audience's reasoning ability? Or is it more persuasive if it is aimed at arousing the audience's emotions? Are people more swayed by a communication if it is tied to a vivid personal experience or if it is bolstered by a great deal of clear and unimpeachable statistical evidence? Should the communication present only one side of the argument, or should it also include an attempt to refute the opposing view? If two sides are presented, as in a debate, does the order in which they are presented affect the relative impact of either side? What is the relationship, 84 the social animal, between the effectiveness of the communication and the discrepancy between the audience's original opinion and the opinion advocated by the communication? Logical versus emotional appeals. Years ago, I was living in a community that was about to vote on whether to fluoridate the water supply as a means of combating tooth decay. An information campaign that seemed quite logical and reasonable was launched by the proponents of fluoridation. It consisted largely of statements by noted dentists describing the benefits of fluorides and discussing the evidence on the reduction of tooth decay in areas with fluoridated water, as well as statements by physicians and other health authorities that fluoridation has no harmful effects. The opponents used a much more emotional appeal. For example, one leaflet consisted of a picture of a rather ugly rat, along with the statement, "Don't let them put rat poison in your drinking water." The referendum to fluoridate the water supply was soundly defeated. Of course, this incident does not prove conclusively that emotional appeals are superior, mainly because the incident was not a scientifically controlled study. We have no idea how the people would have voted on fluoridation if no publicity were circulated. Nor do we know whether the anti-fluoridation circular reached more people, whether it was easier to read than the proponents' literature, and so forth. Although the actual research in this area is far from conclusive, there is some evidence favoring an appeal that is primarily emotional. In one early study, for example, George Hartman 39 tried to measure the extent to which he could induce people to vote for a particular political candidate as a function of what kind of appeal he used. He demonstrated that individuals who received a primarily emotional message voted for the candidate endorsed by the message more often than did people who received a primarily logical message. The word primarily is italicized for good reason. It defines the major problem with research in this area, namely, there are no foolproof, mutually exclusive definitions of emotional and rational. In the fluoridation illustration, for example, most people would probably agree the anti-fluoridation pamphlet was designed to arouse fear, yet, it is not entirely illogical because it is indeed true that the fluoride used in minute concentrations to prevent tooth decay is also used in massive concentrations as a rat poison. On the other side, to present mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 85, the views of professional people is not entirely free from emotional appeal. It may be comforting to know that physicians and dentists endorse the use of fluorides, because, in practice, operational distinctions between logical and emotional are difficult to draw. Some researchers have turned to an equally interesting and far more researchable problem, the problem of the effect of various levels of a specific emotion on opinion change. Suppose you wish to arouse fear in the hearts of your audience as a way of inducing opinion change. Would it be more effective to arouse just a little fear, or should you try to scare the hell out of them? For example, if your goal is to convince people to drive more carefully, would you be more effective if you showed them gory films of the broken and bloody bodies of the victims of highway accidents? Or would you be more effective if you soft-pedaled your communication, showing crumpled fenders, discussing increased insurance rates due to careless driving, and pointing out the possibility that people who drive carelessly may have their driver's licenses suspended? Common sense argues on both sides of this street. On the one hand, it suggests that a good scare will motivate people to act. On the other hand, it argues that too much fear can be debilitating. That is, it might interfere with a person's ability to pay attention to the message, to comprehend it, and to act upon it. We've all believed, at one time or another, that it only happens to the other guy, it can happen to me. Thus, people continue to drive at very high speeds and to insist on driving after they've had a few drinks, even though they should know better. Perhaps this is because the possible negative consequences of these actions are so great that they try not to think about them. Thus, it has been argued that, if a communication arouses a great deal of fear, we tend not to pay close attention to it. What does the evidence tell us? The overwhelming weight of experimental data suggests that, all other things being equal, the more frightened a person is by a communication, the more likely he or she is to take positive preventive action. The most prolific researchers in this area have been Howard Leventhal and his associates. 40 inches one experiment, they tried to induce people to stop smoking cigarettes and to take chest X-rays. Some participants were exposed to a low-fear treatment. They were simply presented with a recommendation to stop smoking and get their chests X-rayed. Others were subjected to moderate fear. They were shown a film depicting a young man whose 86th social animal chest X-rays revealed he had lung cancer. The people subjected to the high fear condition saw the same film as those in the moderate fear condition, and, in addition, they were treated to a gory film of a lung cancer operation. The results showed that those people who were most frightened were also most eager to stop smoking and most likely to get chest X-rays. Is this true for all people? It is not. There is a reason why common sense leads some people to believe that a great deal of fear leads to inaction. It does, for certain people, under certain conditions. What Leventhal and his colleagues discovered is that people who had a reasonably good opinion of themselves were those who were most likely to be moved by high degrees of fear arousal. People with a low opinion of themselves were least likely to take immediate action when confronted with a communication arousing a great deal of fear, but after a delay, they behaved very much like the participants with high self-esteem. That is, if immediate action was not required but action could be taken later, people with low self-esteem were more likely to take that action if they were exposed to a communication arousing a great deal of fear. People with negative self-images may have a great deal of difficulty coping with threats. A high fear communication overwhelms them and makes them feel like crawling into bed and pulling the covers up over their heads. Low or moderate fear is something they can deal with more easily at the moment they experience it. But, if given time, that is, if it's not essential that they act immediately, they will be more likely to act if the message truly scares the hell out of them. Subsequent research by Leventhal and his co-workers lends support to this analysis. In one study, participants were shown films of serious automobile accidents. Some participants watched the films on a large screen up close, others watched them from far away on a much smaller screen. Among the participants with high or moderate self-esteem, those who saw the films on the large screen were much more likely to take subsequent protective action than were those who saw the films on the small screen. Participants with low self-esteem were more likely to take action when they saw the films on a small screen. Those who saw the films on a large screen reported a great deal of fatigue and stated that they had great difficulty even thinking of themselves as victims of automobile accidents. Thus, people with low mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 87 self-esteem are apparently too overwhelmed by fear to take action when an immediate response is required. It should be relatively easy to make people with high self-esteem behave like people with low self-esteem. We can overwhelm them by making them feel there is nothing they can do to prevent or ameliorate a threatening situation. This will lead most people to bury their heads in the sand, even those who have high self-esteem. Conversely, suppose you wanted to reduce the automobile accident rate or to help people give up smoking, and you are faced with low self-esteem people. How would you proceed? If you construct a message containing clear, specific, and optimistic instructions, it might increase the feeling among the members of your audience that they could confront their fears and cope with the danger. These speculations have been confirmed. Experiments by Leventhal and his associates show that fear-arousing messages containing specific instructions about how, when, and where to take action are much more effective than recommendations not including such instructions. For example, a campaign conducted on a college campus urging students to take tetanus shots included specific instructions about where and when they were available. The campaign materials included a map showing the location of the student health service and a suggestion that each student set aside a convenient time to stop by. The results showed high fear appeals to be more effective than low fear appeals in producing favorable attitudes toward tetanus shots among the students, and they also increased the students' stated intentions to take the shots. The highly specific instructions about how to get the shots did not in any way affect these opinions and intentions, but the instructions did have a big effect on the actual behavior of those participants who were instructed about how to proceed. 28% actually got the tetanus shots. But of those who received no specific instructions, only 3% went to get them. In a control group exposed only to the action instructions, no fear-arousing message, no shots were taken. Thus, specific instructions alone are not enough to produce action. Fear is a necessary component for action in such situations. Similar results were uncovered in Leventhal's cigarette experiment. Leventhal found that a high fear communication produced a much greater intention to stop smoking. Unless it was accompanied by recommendations for specific behavior, however, it produced little behavior change. Similarly, specific instructions, by a magazine, 88 The Social Animal, instead of a pack of cigarettes, drink plenty of water when you have the urge to smoke, and so on, without a fear-arousing communication were relatively ineffective. The combination of fear arousal and specific instructions produced the best results. The students in this condition were smoking less 4 months after they were subjected to the experimental procedure. So, in some situations, fear-arousing appeals accompanied by specific instructions for appropriate action can and do produce recommended behaviors, but as Leventhal and his colleagues have indicated, the impact of fear-inducing appeals is context-specific. There are some situations in which fear-arousing appeals, even when coupled with specific instructions, will not produce the desired effect. Sometimes fear appeals may fail because they are not scary enough. Global warming, for example, is a serious threat that most scientists believe is a ticking time bomb. As temperatures rise, glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise, putting many population centers underwater in the coming years. Certain diseases, like malaria, will proliferate when the insects that carry them migrate to formerly cool places. Hurricanes will continue to become more frequent and intense, as will droughts and heat waves, killing people and imperiling the production of food. And so on. Yet, despite these grim predictions, which were vividly depicted in the Oscar-winning movie An Inconvenient Truth, most Americans remain insufficiently frightened to demand action. Recent polls 41 find that people are more afraid of terrorism, snakes, spiders, death, personal failure, and public speaking. Very few among the thousands interviewed even mention being afraid of global warming. Why might this be? Daniel Gilbert 42 suggests that part of the answer lies in the way our brains work. Specifically, our brains evolved to be frightened, and riled to action, by certain kinds of threats, like terrorism and snakes, but not others, like influenza or the adverse effects of prescription drugs, because these latter threats kill many times more people each year than terrorism, and global warming has the potential to inflict death and suffering on a good portion of the human population. Ignoring or denying it is maladaptive. Part of the problem is that we evolved to respond to Stone Age threats, clear and present dangers, not gradual ones. We are also programmed to respond to human threats that are mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 89. Intentional and thus arouse in us a sense of moral indignation. Gilbert suggests that people would be far more likely to demand action on global warming if it were seen as the result of plotting terrorists instead of the unfortunate byproduct of driving cars and deforestation. Perhaps more people would be inclined to take action if, like the stereotypical terrorist, global warming had a mustache. A recent experiment by Matthew McGlone and his colleagues 43 tested this proposition, not by putting a mustache on global warming, but by putting one on another non-human threat, the swine flu virus that became a pandemic in 2009. In April of that year, in response to the rapidly spreading flu, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention made a series of recommendations, including frequent hand washing, avoiding contact with infected individuals, and, above all, getting vaccinated. In the experiment, after these recommendations had been made but before the vaccine became available, McGlone and his team created informational pamphlets that varied in the way they presented facts about the swine flu. In essence, for half the people in the experiment, the flu was depicted as something that people contract. For the other half, the language was changed to depict the flu as a predator. People who received the pamphlet that described the flu as an aggressor were significantly more likely to see the swine flu as frightening, more likely to see themselves as susceptible to it, and more likely to schedule a flu shot. Thus, fear-inducing appeals can be particularly effective if they resonate with our hardwired fear of being attacked. Fear and the threat of terrorism. The McGlone and Leventhal studies illustrate the effectiveness of a fear-arousing appeal coupled with specific instructions for action. But what happens when we are all riled up with fear and don't know what to do?